I'd like to welcome you all tonight to the annual Joy Gottesman UNGERLEIDER Lecture of New York Public Library and live from the NYPL. The UNGERLEIDER Lecture explores themes represented in the holdings of the library's de Rote Jewish Division. We are very grateful for the generous support of the de Rote Foundation, which makes this program possible. I am Stephen Corson, curator of the division. Tonight, I feel very privileged to be able to welcome Carlo Ginzburg, one of the outstanding historians of our time and author of many groundbreaking books, including Ecstasies, Deciphering the Witches' Sabbath, The Cheese and the Worms, The Cosmos of a 16th Century Miller, and his latest collection of essays, Threads and Traces, True, False, Fictive. And I now turn you over to Paul Holdengräber, Director of Live from NYPL.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Paul Holdengräber, as you heard, and I'm the director of Live from the New York Public Library. As you know, my goal here at the library is simply to make the lions roar, to make a heavy, and if you can turn off your cell phones, that would be wonderful, to make a heavy institution dance, and if possible, to make it levitate. Stephen Corson, thank you so much for your introduction, and thank you to the annual Joy Gottesman UNGERLEIDER lecture for their generous support. I'd like to let you know a little bit about our upcoming season. Tomorrow we have Nassim Taleb and Daniel Kahneman. Though the event is sold out and there only may be some standby seats, do come. You never know. Tonight, many people got in, and I'm delighted to see such a full house for Carlo Ginzburg. We will also have Adam Phillips coming later in the season, talking, one of the great psychoanalysts. He wrote a magnificent book called On Kissing, Tickling, and Being Bored. And now he has drawn his attention to the notion, I'm sure all of you might be interested by the subject of frustration. We also have George Saunders and Dick Cavett and Carson, Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, William Gibson, and many just added, for instance, two artists Ed Ruscha and Matthew Barney. So please join our mailing list. Carlo Ginzburg will be signing some books after our conversation. As usual, I wish to thank our independent bookseller, 192 Books. I would also like to invite all of you to come to the reception after the event and to celebrate Carlo Ginzburg, and I would like you to join us for that moment. I could not be more thrilled to be welcoming Carlo Ginzburg tonight, a historian whose work and example matter to me more than just about anybody else in the world. For the past few years, about 5, I have asked the various guests we have had to provide me with a biography in 7 words. A haiku of sorts, or if you're very modern, a tweet. Over the past 5 years, I've had the most divergent responses imaginable. But sometimes responses are actually similar. And since Carlo Ginzburg is interested in difference and similarity, I thought I would give him 4, including his own. Andrew Solomon, who I interviewed in late November, his 7 words: good listeners more interesting than good talkers. And he let me know that it's something his mother used to say to him. I was asked to provide 7 words of my own, which I did, not knowing of Andrew Solomon's. And my 7 words, pronounced many months before Andrew Solomon, was, mother always said, 2 ears, 1 mouth. Werner Herzog, who I've interviewed a few times here, when I asked him for 7 words, not knowing the words that Carlo Ginzburg would offer me, said Werner Herzog, filmmaker, originated in Sachrang, Bavaria. And finally, Carlo Ginzburg, when I asked him for his 7 words, wrote Carlo Ginzburg in parenthesis 1939, historian, lives in Bologna. Please welcome Carlo Ginzburg. Carlo, it is a true pleasure to have you here tonight.
My pleasure, my honor.
It's a wonderful pleasure, and I know that chess matters to you greatly.
It's a metaphor.
How do you mean?
Well, I was asked to provide a sort of reflection on my own intellectual itinerary, and I thought about chess as a metaphor for this. Because there are bifurcations, alternatives, choices, and then I also thought about that line by Benjamin, recording Bertolt Brecht's reflection, and Brecht was saying it would be interesting, that was a Karl Korsch suggestion, to change the rules of chess as a game. So if a piece is going to stay too long on a square, it's going to lose its value. And I thought that this was also an interesting metaphor.
Why?
Well, because insisting too much, at least in my case, on a topic would not be fruitful. This is a sort of apology for, let's say, changing subjects so often, or at least, I mean, I'm old enough to say, retrospectively, that I did not insist on a single topic. I don't know whether the results were fruitful, but this was the result of a sort of unconscious drive, I would say, moving from one topic to another and so on.
Which brings me to the initial move, to use the chess metaphor further. The initial move is so important. It's determining. And in some way, sometimes the move has been done before one even starts the game. It perhaps starts with where one is born, how one is born, who takes care of us and how and in what circumstances. So I'm thinking that a fruitful point of departure, a fruitful first step for us would be in this game of chess we're playing, to begin actually with the title that you chose for tonight and which I adopted.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And it is, I repeat it because it was very surprising in some ways, or maybe not. Being Jewish, becoming Jewish. And I remember telling my 94-year-old father that you had chosen this title, and he said, but he is Jewish. So explain this to me. Explain why.
Well, it's not going to be such a short answer. I have to say something about my family background, which was Jewish on both sides. My father, Leone Ginzburg, was born in Odessa. My mother, who became known as a novelist under the name of Natalia Ginzburg, was born as Natalia Lévi. My grandfather was from Trieste. All of them were secular Jews. I had no religious education. I had no connection even with Jewish festivities, no Hebrew, which I deeply regret. But I was born as a Jew according to the Italian racial laws. 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to check the original document recording my birth. And I saw a line saying, un bambino di razza ebraica, a child of Jewish race. And the clerk who was showing this document was immediately embarrassed, and he said, we should get rid of this. And I said, never. We should keep it as a record of infamy. Now, a few, maybe 10 days ago or something, a former prime minister of Italy, whose name I am not willing to mention, dared to say something to, let's say, excuse those infamous laws, to present them in a sort of milder perspective. This is something which would have never happened 20 years ago. So things can change, sometimes for worse. My mother's mother was the only non-Jewish member of my close family. I suppose that according to some interpretations, I would not be regarded as Jewish. I wouldn't care. My father was born in Odessa, and his family left Russia after the revolution. They moved to Berlin. Finally, they moved to Torino, Turin in Italy. And my father became an Italian citizen in 1931. He was a scholar, a philologist, a literary critic, very precocious. He started to teach Russian literature at the Turin University. And then his academic career ended because he refused to swear the oath of allegiance to the fascist regime in 1934. And a few months after, he was arrested for anti-fascist conspiracy. He had a trial, and he spent 2 years in jail. He was he was a co-founder of the Italian publishing house Einaudi, the most prominent publishing house in Italy until quite recently. Then things changed. My father, when the war started, when Italy entered the war as an ally of Nazi Germany, my father was sent with other foreign Jews to résidence surveillée, to either to islands or to isolated villages, in order to be controlled, easily controlled by the police. And in fact, there are documents, police documents, recording the arrival of Leone Ginzburg, a Russian Jew, to Pizzoli, a village near L'Aquila in Abruzzi, where I spent my early childhood. In 1943, Mussolini's regime collapsed. My father went to Rome, and during the German occupation, he was the director of an underground anti-fascist newspaper. He was arrested in November 1943, sent to jail, recognized on the basis of of a file concerning his former anti-fascist activities, sent to the German section of the jail. He died in February 1944. Now, a few months after, I was with my mother and my mother's grandmother in some hills near Florence. It was the front line. I have a vivid recollection of
You were 5.
I was 5. So there were, there were a real fight. Actually, the Germans were about to retreat, and their retreat towards northern Italy was punctuated by mass slaughter of civilians. And I remember that I was there with my mother and my mother's mother. And my mother's mother once told me, if somebody would ask you, what's your name? You have to say, my name is Carlo Tanzi. This was, in fact, as I realized much later, her father's name, and a non-Jewish name. And actually, she wrote Carlo Tanzi on the front page of a book I was reading. I still remember the title. It was The Happiest Child in the World, Il bambino più felice del mondo. And retrospectively, I think that at that very moment, I became a Jew. Now, I say this during a conversation with last summer in Berlin to two Israeli scholars. And they were shocked. They were shocked. Now, maybe somebody would be shocked by my remark, but I have to explain the implications of this remark. Now, I think that there is a rejection of a notion which is widespread and which I utterly dislike, and this is the notion of identity. I think that identity has been used and is used as a political weapon in order to trace boundaries, in order to marginalize either groups or individuals. And I think that identity cannot be regarded as an analytic category. I would suggest a different approach to what an individual is. Let's imagine that an individual is the point of convergence, of intersection, in fact, not of convergence, the point of intersection between different sets. I belong to the set labeled human species. I belong to other sets as well, meaning the male gender, I'm a member of a linguistic community, of a professional community, retired professors, and so on and so forth. There is one set to also, which I belong as well, but I am the only member of it, meaning fingerprints. Now, fingerprints are certainly utterly individual, but to describe an individual in terms of his or her fingerprints would make sense only from a policeman's point of view. For a historian like myself, I think that, let's say, a different notion of an individual would be helpful, meaning a notion in which generic, less generic, specific, highly specific elements would interact. One of those elements is not Jewishness, a notion which doesn't make sense to me at all, but is a sort of a changing relationship between all those elements and other elements which include also a changing relationship with being Jewish, becoming Jewish. I would like to say something about this, how, let's say, this relationship changed. And I think that there is a sort of, I remember a kind of early turning point which provided me the possibility of locating my family within a larger group. I think that this is an interesting moment because, I mean, our family is something which, at the same time, we take for granted and we regard as unique. But then we learn to see that, notwithstanding that uniqueness, which remains, there is a relationship with other families, or, you know. And I think that I realized this at a moment which I vividly recall. I was a kid, I was 13, and I was in Turin. And I was used to play soccer in a park in Turin. And I met there another kid, same age, and we started to talk, and we became immediately friends. His name was Giovanni Levi. And we started to talk, and we discovered that our families, in fact, knew each other. There were multiple connections. And then we also realized that our names, our first and middle names, were nearly identical. Giovanni Carlo Nello Levi. Carlo Nello Ginzburg. Carlo Nello. Why? This was not a coincidence. Carlo and Nello Rosselli were murdered by Mussolini, by groups acting under the impulse of Mussolini in France, at Bagnole de l'Orne, in 1937. Carlo Rosselli, they were both, they were from a Jewish family, both anti-fascists, but Carlo was a political leader in Paris as an exile. Actually, my father knew him, and they were working in the same group, a political group. And Nello, who was an historian, the real target of the ambush was Carlo. Nello was caught and murdered. And so I realized that, in fact, between, my family and Giovanni Levi's family were connected by multiple threads, which, created a sort of nearly family resemblance. Now, what is bizarre is that I became friends with Giovanni for a couple of years. Then our routes diverged. 20 years later.
But before that, at that point when you were 13, you were also thinking of writing something together with him.
Yes. That's true. We were thinking about that.
And it failed miserably.
But that was, retrospectively, I think that this was, this is my way of describing to myself that project. That was inspired by Italian neorealism, although it was a sort of literary project. But the idea was to follow what I would call now, following Cesare Zavattini, who was the script writer for De Sica and so on. Zavattini spoke about people living in the same apartment and looking at each other. So there was a poetics which was related to that sort of close distance, that kind of forced intimacy, in a sense. And I must say I was quite fascinated by that. And so we talked about Giovanni about the idea of, writing together about how things were going on, but on the spot, so to speak. Anyway,
very quick, and just 1 second.
Yeah.
That was a time also when you were discovering feverishly movies and a certain kind of movies early on, 10, 11, 12, Bicycle Thief and many others. And they formed you in some way.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think that I was, let's say, under the impact of movies and also under the impact of a book, which I read at a ridiculous early age. I think I was 10. And this is a book which was really opaque, but at the same time fascinating. And this was Sergei Eisenstein's writings about cinema. And I remember that I was reading that wonderful essay about yellow as a color, with all those, let's say, anti-Semitic implications and so on. So I was reading, let's say, those pages and also descriptions of movies which I haven't seen at that time. And so, so cinema became certainly very important in my life. It's not important anymore,
but also,
with some exceptions.
But few
exceptions.
Yeah. But I would say, just 1 second, what I would say, though, is it also showed a precocious, wait, don't react so quickly. It showed a precocious relationship to reading things that were beyond your comprehension. That in some way you wanted at the age of 10 to immerse yourself in something that was too difficult.
Yeah, I think that precociousness is not a virtue in itself. Not at all. I mean,
I didn't necessarily mean it as
no. I mean,
yeah.
But I mean, this is just a footnote. So I think that, well, I was, let's say, living in an apartment full of books. And also there was a drive towards certain books. For instance, I read War and Peace very early as a kid.
You were 11 or 12.
Yeah, but again, I mean, trying to make sense of what I was reading, but also under the impact of this incredible book. And in that case, there was a personal element because my father, as I knew, had revised a pre-existing Italian translation of War and Peace when we were in that village during the war. And actually, he wrote an introduction which he was unable to sign, being Jewish, according to the Italian 1938 racial laws. And so there was an asterisk, and I knew very well that actually in reading that introduction that this was my father's introduction. So there were, let's say, personal elements. Maybe also the fact that Eisenstein was Russian played a role. It's possible.
Now move forward 20 years.
Okay. I mean, before that, let's say, new convergence, new crossing with Giovanni Levi's paths, well, when we met, we discovered that we were both historians. We had become historians. And we started to work together around a journal, Quaderni Storici, about a project which involved Carlo Poni, Edoardo Grandi, especially those two absolutely brilliant historians, and the two of us, Giovanni and myself. And so we worked on a project which was labeled microhistory. But it's maybe interesting to see how we arrived to that convergence. And as far as I am concerned, I would like to say something which is related to tonight's topic, meaning my decision to become an historian. I was 20, I was in the library of Scuola Normale in Pisa, where I was studying, and I suddenly decided, at the same moment, this is quite bizarre, but I decided first to try to become a historian. Secondly, to work on witchcraft trials. And thirdly, not to focus on the persecution as such, but on the victims of the persecution, their attitudes, their beliefs. Now, this moment was the turning, decided my professional career, my intellectual trajectory until this very moment. Because there was something paradoxical in the third decision. I mean, the second decision, meaning to work on witchcraft trials in a historical perspective, was not certainly fashionable at that moment in 1959. It was, let's say, a sort of marginal, bizarre topic. It became fashionable later. But the idea of focusing on, let's say, the victims, that implied a real paradox. Because a paradox because we have documents, those trials, which had been, let's say, produced and controlled and written by the inquisitors and their notaries. So everything is distorted by, let's say, that production, the trial itself implying potentially torture, which was often used, implying suggestive questions, did you ever go to the witches' Sabbath and so on? So, I mean, it's a kind of, all those documents are, in a way, unreliable. Unreliable from a factual perspective, not only from that perspective, because one could say, what can you learn from those documents in order to rescue the attitudes of those people? Okay, so the paradox is there, I think. And I was, on the one hand, extremely lucky, because after a few years, I found an extraordinary archival fund in Udine, in Friuli, which was related to a counter-witches sect, so to speak. And what was crucial about those documents, I'm talking about documents, trials which took place between 1570 and 1670. What was extraordinary about those documents was the fact that there was a gap between the inquisitors' not only questions, but expectations, and the defendants' answers. I still remember, I wrote something about this years ago, my first encounter with one of those trials. This was a mere chance, and this took place not in Friuli, but in Venice at the Archivio di Stato. And I wrote a piece about this, trying to make sense of my reaction to this document. So there was a young peasant, a shepherd, and the inquisitors asked, are you a benandante? Word I never heard before. And somebody who goes for good, good walker, you may say. And then he said, yes, I go in spirit 4 times a year in the meadow of Josaphat, and we fight with witches, and there is a smell of roses. And I remember that I read this, 3 pages, and I became so excited that I left the archive, and I started to walk along the Frari Church, where all those marvelous paintings are preserved, Titian, Bellini, and so on. And I was smoking at the time. I was a smoker, and I was smoking and thinking, but I mean, well, this is extraordinary. Now, why
extraordinary because in some way there was recognition. There was something...
recognition, but at the same time, recognition of a gap. Because what was crucial was the gap. In other words, the amazement of the inquisitors who were unable to make sense of those tales. And actually, they tried to shape those tales with, let's say, questions, torture, and so on, in order to replace them into a pre-existing narrative, meaning the witches' Sabbath narrative. But for a long time, decades, in fact, and some very long and diverse trials, there was this gap. So I could say, and this was my point, that in that case, the superposition was a sort of later phenomenon. First, there were, let's say, beliefs which were, let's say, autonomous, in quotation marks, autonomous peasant beliefs. And so I started to analyze them. Now, the victims, focusing on the victims. I felt this emotional identification with the victims. And this went on. I wrote a book which has been mentioned, The Cheese and the Worms, on one of those victims. Some years later, that was, I think, in 1978, a friend of mine, Paolo Fossati, who died years ago, said, but after all, I mean, this is obvious. I mean, you are Jewish and you have been working on witches and heretics. And I was amazed, not by his statement, which seemed to me absolutely obvious, but by the fact that I had, let's say, repressed that continuity.
Repressed in...
Well, unconsciously repressed.
But repressed in the true Freudian...
Well, let's say I had erased that continuity. That continuity never... Okay, first of all, there is the fact, meaning the fact that I never thought about that continuity. So I must say, as a, let's say, many Freud's readers would say, this was a sort of unconscious act first. Now, why? Well, I think that my reaction again as a reader of Freud would be if I, let's say, if I refuse to become conscious of that continuity, the continuity meant a lot to me. There was something really important about that continuity. This would be, has been my interpretation. So in order to make this continuity productive, it would have been, should have been unconscious. So this was my, let's say, retroactive interpretation. But certainly, I never thought about that. Now, later, in the late 80s, I wrote a piece, which a little conference which took place in this country, which was called The Inquisitor as Anthropologist. Because in the meantime, I had realized with some real embarrassment that notwithstanding my emotional continuity with the victims, there was also an intellectual continuity with inquisitors. And so I tried to make sense of this, of those two continuities, including that most disturbing intellectual continuity with inquisitors. Now, this, paradoxically, is, in my view, retrospectively, another stage of my becoming Jewish. Why? Well, first of all, the emotional identification with the victims. That's obvious enough. I mean, being Jewish. You pointed to me. You recalled to me an essay by my mother, which is called in English Universal Compassion. An essay which I read when it appeared, I reread when it was included in a collection of essays in 1970, but it's an essay I never thought about until this morning.
Can I read a paragraph?
Yes.
I want you to hear your mother's words as read here in English. In this essay of 1970, October 1970, to grant any value to our moral judgment is too daunting. To use it feels too shameful. All we have at our disposal today is a vast compassion for ourselves and the world at large. With universal compassion, surely we can't go wrong. It is the one feeling we can give ourselves up to without fear of error. Such a flood of pity in ourselves and others may seem bizarre, given that our world and its vicissitudes are consummately cruel and pitiless, offering not the faintest glimpse of the profound pity that imbues us. Then again, our compassion is informed neither by intelligence nor by any real will to improve the world or ourselves. It is merely the result of fatigue and confusion, like a nervous outburst of tears that leaves us prostrate but unchanged. In any case, tears cannot lead us astray, for without a doubt the world will find ourselves, the world we find ourselves in has earned them.
Yeah. So, I mean, this explains, and at the end there is something about, let's say, the identification with the victim. This is certainly part of my education. It's something which, I mean, you may immediately recognize. However, the really troubling part of the essay is not this one. But it's the beginning.
I believe the worst of our present misfortunes is our difficulty in the face of whatever event in distinguishing the victims from the oppressors. No matter what transpires, whether public or private, our intellectual response is to avidly pursue the root causes and seek out the probable guilty parties. But before long, we stop short in bewilderment. The causes appear numberless, the reality too tortuous and complex for human judgment. We have come to recognize that no event, public or private, can be considered or judged in isolation. For the more deeply we probe, the more we find infinitely ramifying events that preceded it, all the way back to its source. In such a subterranean labyrinth, tracking down the guilty and the innocent seems a hopeless quest. The truth darts from place to place, slipping and sliding in the dark like a fish or a mouse.
So at the end, there is this, let's say, commitment to a moral judgment anyway. So we have to be on the side of the victims. But the troubling part is the beginning, when she wrote that it's difficult to, let's say, make a distinction between victims and oppressors. What is this? I mean, I read the essay. It's evident. This, I mean, looks like today as a reflection on the state of Israel. And I think it was, at that time, a reflection on the state of Israel. 1970. Because certainly my mother, I mean, she became more and more troubled. But it was really troubling even at that time, even in 1970. So I think I must say, and I'm sure that a lot of people here would disagree with me, but I think that in those remarks, there is a prophetic element. I mean, my mother said very often that she had no political flair or political intelligence. And actually, she became elected as an independent member, as a writer, as an independent candidate in the list of the Italian Communist Party. I tried to convince her not to run, not to be elected, but I did not succeed. But because I thought that, I mean, actually she had no sense for politics, but in another sense, she had a deep sense, a deep perception of what was going on in the public sphere. Even if she was absolutely foreign, in a sense, from public events. I mean, she followed what happened, but she was not a political person in a sense. And she said this very often, but on another level, okay, so there is a word which I would use at her place in this context, but I have to check the Italian original again, but a word which she never used in this context, meaning ambivalence. And this is, in fact, a crucial term for my becoming Jewish. Ambivalence. Ambivalence in which sense? Not only ambivalence about, let's say, Israeli politics. I was in Israel recently. I've been in Israel many times, and I have friends there. And I mean, that ambivalence about, let's say, what is taking place in Israel is really painful to me, as to many, many people. But there is another ambivalence, which is something which is not part of this essay, but which became crucial in my own work, and in the way in which my becoming Jewish had an impact on my own work. What is this? Okay, we have this disjunction. Emotional identification with the victims of the Inquisition, intellectual continuity with the inquisitors. I have been reflecting for many years on this. And then I realized, and I think this was the only idea I had in my life, which is the following. What we label historical perception is the result, the outcome of the Christian attitude towards the Jews. And this is something which is shared by Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists like myself, atheist Jews like myself, and so on. Meaning the idea that something can be true according to one context, but different and in a sense even more true according to another perspective. So the idea of historical perspective is in fact the outcome of the Christian reading of the Old Testament. I wrote an essay on this entitled Distance and Perspective, and this was the result of, let's say, basically two works, two great works, very different in time also. One is Erich Auerbach's Mimesis. The other one is Amos Funkenstein's Theology and Imagination. Unfortunately, I never met, for biographical reasons, Auerbach, but I was lucky enough to meet and to become friend of Amos Funkenstein, a great man, a great scholar. Erich Auerbach inspired my work, has been inspiring my work until today. He wrote a memorable essay in 1938 called Figura, and the idea of figural reading is at the very center of his book, Mimesis. What is figural reading? Is the Christian reading of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, as a figural anticipation of the New. Now this, as analyzed by Auerbach, is magnificent. This is in fact a sort of anatomy of the Christian interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, of the relationship between the New and the Old Testament. But from a historical point of view, this is obviously an inversion of the genetic relationship between passages from the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels. I wrote a little essay on this issue. And I must confess, I'm really fond of that essay, even if it had no specific echo. But for some reason, what I wrote...
What is the essay?
Ecce.
How you write?
Okay.
In wooden eyes.
Wooden eyes. Wooden eyes. I think the biblical roots of Christian imagery, something like this. So I simply, the move, again, in a sort of, as in a chess game, was very simple.
Scriptural
roots
of Christian devotional
images. Anyway, the move was very simple. If we take that notion in the Gospels about the fulfillment of prophecies, okay, do you believe in fulfillment of prophecies? I don't. So what's the meaning of this? The meaning of this is to take a passage from the Isaiah, for instance, or the Psalms and so on, and then turn it into a narrative fragment related to the life of Jesus. And now, in that essay, I said that I believe, not as a religious man, I'm not, but I believe that Jesus as a historical character existed. But I also believe, and I try to argue and to demonstrate, that in fact, full sections of the Gospels concerning Jesus' infancy and Jesus' death, passion and death, are simply narrative reworkings of passages from, again, from, let's say, the Isaiah, the Psalms, and so on. And this can be demonstrated. Now, what is interesting is that there has been, in my view, a sort of self-censorship among scholars about this crucial phenomenon. Why? Well, because Christians were, Christian scholars of different affiliations were obviously shy about this, although there were some scholars. For instance, Christian Stendhal. Some people work on this, but in a rather cautious way. Jewish scholars were also shy for different reasons. So some of them pointed at the fact that Jesus was rooted in a lot of Jewish traditions. Of course, he was a Jew. But this fact concerning, let's say, the texts and the relationship, the genetic relationship between passages from the Old Testament and the New Testament, a Christian would say, well, this is something which is, in my view, important. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because on the one hand, I became conscious of this ambivalence. I mean, the Christian ambivalence towards the Jews, persecuting the Jews at the same time keeping, notwithstanding Marcho and so on, keeping the Hebrew Bible as as part of the Holy Book, the Scriptures. So this ambivalence, and I think that ambivalence was not part of my education at all.
What was part of your education was being read to, early on, terrifying tales. The Sicilian tales, folk tales, you were read to very early on, I think including by your mother, if I'm not mistaken, also shaped you.
A lot.
And maybe you can say something about, first of all, the Sicilian tales and how they shaped you a lot.
Those tales were, let's say, recorded and rewritten by a Sicilian late 19th century writer, Luigi Capuana. They are splendid folk tales. I mean, there is only, in Italian, there is only one, let's say, collection of fairy tales which is comparable to those, meaning Italo Calvino's Fiabe Italiane. But Capuana was extraordinary. And I never worked.
Stuff.
Extremely so. I still remember something which retrospectively looks to me as a sort of, let's say, anticipation of my much later research. Meaning there is a fairy tale about a young girl who comes to a house, and there she meets a little man as tall as this, named Gomitetto. And he has a turban with a very long feather. And she looks at him, they start to talk and so on. And then you turn the page, and Gomitetto turns into a werewolf. And the werewolf is, let's say, going to devour the little girl. So I remember that I was turning the pages. There are beautiful illustrations by Carlo Chiostri, a remarkable late 19th century illustrator. And I remember that I got the feeling that the Gomitetto, the little man, was much more scary than the werewolf. So this is already ambivalence, in a sense. But moral ambivalence, no, this is something which was not part of my education. Actually, there were two things which I, let's say, learned very late in my life. They were not part of my education, and they are both in some way related to my becoming Jewish. One is ambivalence, Christian ambivalence towards the Jews, and then casuistry. Again, Catholic casuistry, Jesuit casuistry, but also the Talmud, which is unfortunately inaccessible to me in Hebrew. But the idea that casuistry is not only a Catholic phenomenon. I'm fascinated by casuistry, I must say. I'm working on casuistry. I wrote a piece on Machiavellian casuistry and so on. So this became a sort of...
For those who don't know, what is casuistry?
Yes. I mean, casuistry is a branch of moral theology in Christian religion, especially in the Catholic religion, especially, let's say, Jesuits wrote a lot about casuistry, which means looking at, let's say, general laws, moral laws, and then looking for cases which can become an exception. So in which cases, let's say, a moral law, meaning, for instance, you shall not kill, becomes licit. So you may see, let's say, the convergence between different cultural traditions, religious traditions, and so on. It's certainly not a pure Christian phenomenon, but I mean, in Christianity, casuistry was apparently murdered to death, with no exceptions, by Pascal in his Lettres Provinciales. And only recently, casuistry reemerged through biomedicine and biotechnology. Because, I mean, you are confronted with cases. And, I mean, you have, let's say, bifurcations. Should we, let's say, invest an enormous amount of money in order to heal such and such person, or another person who is, and so on and so on. There is a sort of parable by Clifford Geertz about this. So casuistry re-emerged. There is a book by a Jesuit and Stephen Toulmin, the British pupil of Wittgenstein, about the emergence or something like this of casuistry, or the relevance of casuistry. In fact, the re-emergence, because it became, let's say, acceptable again.
A brief return to your mother and the atmosphere in which you grew up. You grew up, you were mentioning your father working on Tolstoy. Your mother worked on Proust. And Proust, she translated the first volume of Du Côté de chez Swann.
Yeah.
Bring me back to her translations of Proust and to what it meant for you.
I read Proust in French, not in my mother's translation. I mean, there is a sort of a strange, not ambivalence, but a strange relationship. In other words, Proust was familiar to me through my mother. As I was a child, I mean, simply because, I mean, she told me there is a book about a child who loved his mother so much and he waited for, you know. So I remember this. And then I knew that actually there was this translation, and I remember that, but then when I learned French by, by reading Proust, Proust and Baudelaire. But at the same time, Proust, French was for me, since the very beginning, a sort of a langue maternelle, not from the point of view of results, but from the point of view of the emotional investment. As if my mother would have been, let's say, sort of a guarantee, or, sort of I mean, in some way it was a language which was associated to my mother through Proust, in fact. Anyway, so Proust also had a great impact on my own work for different reasons.
It's interesting some of the intellectual figures that have mattered to you so much. You mentioned Erich Auerbach, and I think Auerbach, not only figura but mimesis, is so important. Perhaps also the way in which you were mentioning being 20 in the library in Pisa, and I think of the great conclusion of Mimesis of Auerbach, where he talks about being able to write this book, which goes from Homer to Virginia Woolf, if I'm not mistaken, only, and he's in Turkey at that moment, in Istanbul, and he, thankfully, in some strange way, doesn't have use of all of his books. And so he can write this incredible book because he is writing it in some way from memory.
Yeah, true. No, this is a book which had an enormous impact on me and has on innumerable readers. And actually, I tried to play a sort of game with the book a few times.
Analyzed one of them.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, I wrote an essay on Stendhal, starting from the same passage which had been commented upon by Auerbach. I mentioned microhistory before, and actually for me, not for my friend Giovanni Levi, but or for other people involved in microhistory, but for me, microhistory was deeply associated with Auerbach. I mean, this Auerbach and Spitzer as well. I mean, this idea of, let's say, close reading of a fragment and trying to, starting from a fragment in order to make sense of the whole. So there is a sort of a va-et-vient. Anyway, so I learned a lot from Auerbach. But then there was this sort of, I wouldn't say competition, of course, but the kind of game. So I started from the same passage in Le Rouge et le Noir.
But you might say competition.
Okay, let's say competition. Okay, so I started from, let's say, that passage, the same passage, and then I went into a different direction using one of those pieces of not really secondary literature in this case, but an essay which was presumably not accessible to Auerbach in Istanbul, meaning a self-review written by Stendhal of Le Rouge et le Noir under a pseudonym, which is a fantastic piece. And so I used this in order to provide a different reading of the same passage. Then I wrote another essay in which I started from a marvelous chapter in Auerbach's book about Voltaire's Lettres philosophiques, about the London Stock Exchange. And he said, here there are, let's say, Quakers, Catholics, Jews, and they, let's say, each of them follow different rituals and so on, described in a sort of sarcastic way by Voltaire. And then they meet and they trade and so on. So this stock exchange is a kind of embodiment of tolerance, a fantastic piece. Actually, Anyway, so I tried to put Voltaire in perspective and also Auerbach in perspective. He used that word perspective in order to describe his own approach. And so I tried to use a kind of double binocular, I don't know, something like this, or telescope, microscope.
I don't think I'll surprise anyone by saying that the range of the references are so tremendous, and you use a way of describing how you begin a research, which to my mind I have totally adapted. I've nearly made it my own, and for those people who don't know your work, I just have completely stolen it from you. And the term is the euphoria of ignorance. You talk about approaching a work with this euphoria of ignorance, this unbridled enthusiasm, not quite knowing where you're going. And that's what, c'est à la faveur de cela. It's because of that in some way you are able to proceed. And I'm...
Yeah, but I mean, the range of topics is in fact very large, unusually large, but it's not a virtue in itself. It's not. It's not, because I mean, as I told you once, I mean, one can say banal or silly things about a variety of things, So, I mean, I'm not saying that this is a...
You're not proud of that.
Not proud of that.
But you were talking. But you were saying. If we go back to that fundamental space of 1959, 20-year-old, since we know the date of birth, since it was part of your 7 words, a 20-year-old Carlo Ginzburg at the library, at the Scuola Normale lucky to discover these three things that are absolute, three things that were not so sure for you, because before becoming a historian, you wanted to be a painter, you wanted to be a novelist, and you discovered, and I'm interested by this, you discovered that you were not good at this. I'm curious how one knows.
Well, I mean, it was easy. I looked at my paintings, I read what I was writing. No, that was easy. No, I think that...
But come back because I want you to explore this notion a little bit more of the euphoria of ignorance, because the word euphoria and ignorance and combined, they very much serve as a motto for me in what I myself do, which is being in some way, I don't know exactly what it is, but voracious at the same time as euphoric and certainly ignorant. I mean, so all of this somehow, and à l'affût, always wanting more, and an appetite which is insatiable.
Well, I think that I love to be taken by surprise. I mean, let's say coming across something which is unknown and surprising. And then I have to learn something. I have to learn how to cope with this new event or fragment of knowledge and so on. And actually, I wrote a little piece which is called, it's a short piece, and there is an even shorter piece, I think, on the web, which is called Conversations with Orion. Orion is the name of the software of the UCLA library. I taught many years at UCLA, and so I tried to describe a sort of devious way, an oblique way of using any catalog, including card catalogs, which should be preserved in any library as monuments. Anyway.
That's an aside to where we are now.
Let me say this. I mean, as an act of faith. Okay, from an atheist. I try to suggest different ways of using not only card catalogs, but also very quickly, very effectively, online catalogs. Looking for a word like bizarre, or let's say, actually, I mean, I described an experiment in which I was looking for Cafre, because the idea was to start from a passage, the first paragraph in Voltaire's Traité de Métaphysique, a posthumous text which is magnificent. So I thought, well, it would be interesting to try to reconstruct the horizon of expectations of Voltaire's readers, starting from each word in the paragraph, and then checking the word in Orion, in UCLA library catalog. So let's see what will emerge. And the idea was that what was going to emerge was a constellation which was untouched, that is also unpolluted by human intelligence, except for the intelligence embodied in the engine itself, in the software. Okay, so I mean, the enterprise was in fact crazy, because I mean, I think that it can be done, something like this, but not starting from a text by Voltaire. And we know, I mean, a lot of things about Voltaire's readers, but certainly something different would emerge, and this was, in fact, what emerged. In other words,
I'm also interested that you should choose as a conversation partner Orion.
Why?
It's interesting that you're addressing this engine as
because I'm asking questions, and so I said Cafre, and Orion said 7 titles. So I looked at them, and I looked at the earliest title, completely unknown title, by an unknown person, a man named Purie. So I went to the something published in Amsterdam in 1715, but the book was available on the stacks because there were photocopies. of the only edition, 18th century edition. So I looked at it in 5 minutes, and I was immediately taken by that book.
This is what is fascinating, is immediately taken by this photocopy that Orion had delivered to you of Curie. What is this?
What is this?
What is it? I mean, you say in that text, it is a slow accumulation of experience that makes the instantaneous reaction to chance possible.
Yeah, at the end of my little piece, I mentioned photography. Because even in that case, when you have, let's say, Robert Capa or Henri Cartier-Bresson, you have, let's say, a sort of immediate reaction to an ephemeral event, but behind that immediate reaction, there is a sort of there are layers and layers of visual experience, all kind of experiences, and so on. So you may say the same about, let's say, reacting to a title in the catalog, something unknown, an unknown person presenting a project for colonizing colonization of the west side of Australia and South Africa. What is this? Why in 1715? And so on. So I looked at the book, and then there is something which suddenly may start, which is also a trap, meaning an immediate reaction and a sort of anticipation of interpretation. So I thought, Max Weber. Why? Well, because I mean, there was a sort of the idea of entrepreneur, and then let's say a lot of quotations from the Old Testament, but I didn't know anything about this man. I discovered that he was a Calvinist from Neuchâtel, and actually, in that little paper, actually I went to South Carolina with my wife to visit a city which had been founded by that man, Petersburg. Nothing exists anymore. Only a graveyard, and then a sign, Petersburg. Fantastic. This man had fantastic projects about the colonization of countries placed near, I'm going to give the wrong figure, placed at 34, I think, latitude south. Then he didn't succeed, so he tried 34 latitude north. I can be wrong, maybe 35, 36. But why? Why that figure? The Holy Land. That Calvinist was trying to colonize a new promised land. So I ended this, actually the subtitle of my paper is called An Exercise in Microhistory, and I was lucky enough to be invited when I was working on that paper in Istanbul. And so I opened my piece. It was a conference on globalization, and I opened my piece with a homage to Auerbach, of course. And then I tried to use this case, in order to engage a dialogue between Max Weber and Karl Marx. So, I mean...
I'm wondering whether this desire to engage a conversation between various characters, what one might call a kind of a dialogic relationship between characters, is something also that might have something to do with becoming Jewish.
Yeah, I believe so. I believe so because, let's say, well, I'm not going to say anything on Buber because I simply started to read Buber, but just a little bit. But certainly I was very much influenced by Bakhtin, who was explicitly indebted to Buber. And so the idea of let's say, a dialogic, or let's say, the idea of finding a dialogic dimension in texts which are not necessarily dialogic, has been certainly shaped by, let's say, evidence which is formally dialogic, like Inquisition trials. But then I tried to find a dialogic dimension even in a chronicle written by an early 18th century Jesuit named Les Gobiens. And in that essay, I tried to show how an harangue delivered by a native leader, so we have this full text of a harangue delivered according to the Jesuit in the Mariana Islands. So this harangue was shaped was inspired by different texts, Tacitus, and so on and so forth. But there is also a dialogic dimension, not only the fictitious dialogue with the, let's say, leader of the native conspiracy, but also there is a fragment which, in fact, has been commented by the Jesuits saying, this doesn't make sense. There is a footnote. And the native leader was supposed to say, those Europeans, because this is a sort of attack against the European civilization, provided by a Jesuit. And so the leader said, those Europeans brought us all kind of evils, including sickness and insects and so on. And so the Jesuits said, but it's absurd. So again, you see a gap between the fictitious text and the footnote provided by the author of the fictitious text. That is the split attitude, this inner dialogue. This will be the title of my Buber lecture in Jerusalem in May, about something else, inner dialogues.
As we slowly bring this to a close, I'd like to contrast and compare a quotation from your mother and from you, from Natalia Ginzburg in this Little Virtues. She says, if it seems children are wasting the best of their energies and skills, lying on the sofa reading ridiculous novels, or charging around a football pitch, then again we cannot know whether this is really a waste of energy and skill, or whether tomorrow this too will bear fruit in some way that we have not yet suspected. And then from you, in the Italian edition of Clue's Myths and the Historical Method, I have permitted myself to be guided by chance and curiosity, not by a conscious strategy, but what appeared to be distractions, although, as you have made clear, fascinating ones, at the time now do not seem such.
Well, thank you very much. I never thought about that kind of echo, or let's say.
But there is an echo.
Well, I mean, I'm my mother's son, so I learned everything from her. That's for sure. That's for sure. It's not strange, I think.
It's not strange, but it's also not explicit at moments. It sometimes is by roads that we don't quite. I mean, as you said earlier, you know, to continue slightly before ending this notion of repression, and this notion not only of repression but of unawareness, as you call it. And I think unawareness is perhaps more of a word that works for you.
Okay,
and
one could say there is an awareness on both sides. So parents, let's say, deliver deliberate teachings, but at the same time there is something they are unaware of, and this may be the most important thing in education. So it's something which is not really controlled. And then, I mean, on the kids' part, or let's say on the side of the next generation, there is this idea of learning something but being unaware of what is really important. Maybe what is really important becomes explicit after 50 years.
The same way becoming Jewish becomes something you discover. I mean, not you discover, but it's like a continuous burp. It's sort of,
reworking. I mean, there is some kind of reworking of, let's say,
But it's a reworking. It's certainly not something that Carlo Ginzburg would have spoken about 20 years ago in this way.
Not in that way, but I think 20 years ago I was already very well aware that, let's say, my relationship with being Jewish had been profoundly shaped by the persecution. You remember that famous piece by Jean-Paul Sartre, which is a strange piece. I have not Réflexion sur la question juive. I've not reread the piece recently, but certainly there is a lot of bad conscience in that piece. After all, Sartre's attitude during the German occupation was problematic. His plays were performed in Paris and so on. So, I mean, I think that one should read or reread that piece keeping all this in mind. However, there is something in that piece which I think is valuable, meaning that, let's say, the interaction between, let's say, anti-Semitic attitudes and Jews shaped the ways in which maybe not all Jews, but certainly many Jews emerged from the persecution, and that's the time. I mean, the essay was written in 1946, so it's a sort of retrospective reflection. I understand now that one of the persons which is mentioned and even described in a sense is Aron. Yeah, but anyway, so I would have, even 20 years ago, I would have said persecution was crucial in shaping my own relationship with the fact of being Jewish and also becoming Jewish. But then other things emerged, because actually what I reject about the notion of identity is the fact that it's something fixed, given once for all.
That is why the chess game is important.
As a metaphor.
Thank you very much.